There is a moment that nobody talks about. It happens at the exact midpoint between triumph and catastrophe. Suspended in a space so thin you could paper cut yourself on it. It lasts approximately 5 minutes, and during those 5 minutes, the most expensive machine human beings have ever hurled beyond the protection of their home planet becomes, for all practical purposes, a fireball with people inside it. No communication, no telemetry, no signal of any kind. Mission control goes silent. Families watching from the bleachers go silent. The entire planet, with its satellites and fiber optics and 5-bar cellular signals, cannot reach 4 human beings who are falling through the atmosphere at 32 times the speed of sound, wrapped in a cocoon of ionized plasma hot enough to melt titanium, trusting that a layer of ablative material between them and the void is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And here is what should arrest you before we go any further. We have known about this problem since the 1960s. We knew about it during Mercury. We knew about it during Gemini. We knew about it during every single Apollo mission. 60 years of computational advancement, 60 years of material science, 60 years of simulation technology, and we still cannot talk to our astronauts during the most dangerous 4 minutes of their lives. We just wait. On April 10th, 2026, a spacecraft named Integrity dropped through the atmosphere off the coast of San Diego and hit the Pacific Ocean under 3 enormous red and white parachutes. Inside were Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen. They had just traveled 252,756 miles from Earth, farther than any human beings in the 4.5 billion year history of this planet. They had broken a record that stood since 1970, when Apollo 13 swung around the far side of the moon with a crippled engine and a crew desperately trying not to die. That record had lasted 53 years. Artemis II erased it in 10 days. The recovery was flawless. Navy divers hit the water within minutes. The capsule was hoisted onto the deck of the USS Portland. The crew emerged to applause that echoed across every news network on the planet. NASA Associate Administrator Jim Free stood in front of the cameras and said the words that were designed to be the headline. The path to the lunar surface is open now. And the coverage was almost universally a symphony of triumph. Mission accomplished. America is going back to the moon. The future of human spaceflight is here. I want you to hold that feeling for a moment. I want you to really sit inside it because it is genuine. Artemis II was an extraordinary achievement. The numbers alone should make your chest tighten with something close to awe. 700,000 miles. A flight path angle accurate to 0.4%. Peak velocity of 24,664 miles per hour. Roughly fast enough to cross the entire continental United States in about 6 minutes. Victor Glover became the first black astronaut to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Christina Koch, who already held the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, added farthest woman from Earth to her resume. Jeremy Hansen became the first Canadian and only the second non-American in history to leave the Earth-Moon system entirely. These are not small things. These are marks carved into the permanent record of what our species has done. And on April 6, 2026, while the spacecraft was swinging around the far side of the moon, something happened that no human being had ever witnessed. The Earth moved in front of the sun. For 53 minutes, the crew floated inside their spacecraft and watched a total solar eclipse from lunar orbit. The solar corona extending outward in streamers of plasma that Jeremy Hansen described, with a pilot's economy of language, as looking like baby hairs against the blackness. Christina Koch photographed the lunar limb topography against the corona and produced images that planetary scientists will be studying for years. It was, by any measure, one of the most beautiful moments in the history of human exploration. So, when I tell you that something is deeply structurally wrong with the story being told about Artemis II, when I tell you that underneath the celebration there is a second story, a story written not in press releases but in post-flight inspection reports and dosimetry readings and engineering change requests, I need you to understand that I am not dismissing the triumph. The triumph is real, but triumphs can have shadows. And sometimes the shadows are the most important part. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning of this story does not start on April 1st, 2026, when Artemis II launched from Kennedy Space Center on a column of 8.8 million pounds of thrust. It starts in November 2022 with a different mission entirely. Artemis I was unscrewed, a test flight. The whole point was to send the Orion capsule to the moon and back without anyone inside, to stress test the systems, to find the problems before you put human beings at risk. By every metric that NASA was publicly measuring, Artemis I was a success. 25 days, lunar orbit, splashdown, standing ovation, and then the engineers pulled the capsule out of the water and brought it back to the lab. What they found on the heat shield should have stopped the program cold. More than 100 locations on the aft-coat-ablative thermal protection system showed damage that no pre-flight model had predicted. Not minor wear, not acceptable degradation within expected parameters. Cracking, spalling, chunks of charred material that had broken away from the surface in fragments large enough to leave visible debris trails behind the spacecraft during re-entry. The heat shield had not failed. The mission had survived, but it had not behaved as designed. Not remotely. Now, here is why this matters in a way that transcends engineering jargon. The heat shield on the Orion spacecraft is not a backup system. It is not one layer in a redundant architecture. It is the thing. The single physical barrier between four human beings and approximately 2,706 degrees Celsius of superheated plasma that forms around a re-entering spacecraft moving at Mach 32. If the heat shield fails, not cracks, not spalls, but actually fails the heat of re-entry, reaches the aluminum alloy structure of the spacecraft, what happens next is what happened to Space Shuttle Columbia on February 1st, 2003. The vehicle breaks apart. The crew does not survive. There is no escape system for re-entry. There is no abort. There is no plan B. The heat shield either works or it does not. And the one that flew on Artemis I had done something that the engineers who designed it did not expect. NASA spent the better part of a year and a half investigating. They pulled approximately 200 aft-coat samples from the shield and brought them to Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. They ran tests. They ran models. They debated. And eventually they identified the root cause, and it was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The problem was gas. During the skip re-entry trajectory that Artemis I flew, a technique where the capsule dips into the upper atmosphere, bounces back up briefly, then plunges down again for final descent. There was a phase between the dips where external heating rates dropped while internal temperatures in the avcot material remained extremely high. Gases produced by the normal ablation process became trapped inside the material. The outer char layer was not permeable enough to let them vent. Pressure built up. The char cracked. Pieces broke off. The fix, in engineering terms, was obvious. Make the material more permeable. Let it breathe. The gases vent naturally. Pressure never builds. The ablation process works exactly as designed. NASA did not do that. Instead, they changed the trajectory. For Artemis II, the re-entry profile was modified from a skip re-entry to what engineers call a loft re-entry, a different atmospheric entry angle designed to maintain continuous, higher heating throughout the descent. The logic is counterintuitive but genuine. By keeping the heating rate higher and more consistent, the outer char layer stays hot enough to remain permeable on its own. The gases can vent, the pressure does not build. The cracking, in theory, does not occur. Read that again. NASA's solution to a heat shield that cracked under too much heat during one phase of re-entry was to expose the crew to more heat, not less, more. They did not fix the material. They changed how they flew through the atmosphere around it. An independent review team signed off on the approach. NASA expressed confidence. The crew expressed confidence. And on April 10, 2026, the modified trajectory was flown for the first time with human beings aboard. And those human beings survived, which is the moment where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because survival is not the same as validation. And validation is not the same as understanding. And understanding is not the same as safety. But the cameras were rolling when the parachutes deployed. The cameras were rolling when the capsule hit the water. The cameras were rolling when the crew walked out onto the deck of the USS Portland and squinted into the California sunshine. And none of the cameras were in the lab where engineers were about to begin what NASA's own public communications carefully described as the most closely watched post-flight heat shield inspection in the history of the Artemis program. Because here is the thing that the celebration was not designed to show you. As of the moment those cameras were broadcasting that splashdown live to millions of people around the world, as Jim Free was declaring that the path to the lunar surface was open, nobody knew whether the heat shield workaround had actually worked. The inspection had not happened yet. The results were not in. The $4 billion crewed spacecraft had just re-entered Earth's atmosphere at Mach 32 on a trajectory specifically designed to compensate for a material flaw discovered 3 years earlier, and the question of whether that compensation had been sufficient was still, in the most literal sense, an open one. The celebration happened. The inspection was still pending. The triumph was broadcast to the world. And those two things should not sit comfortably together. But the heat shield is not even where the story gets strangest. It is where it starts. Because Artemis II was a 10-day mission. 10 days. In those 10 days, with a crew of 4, on a trajectory designed to be the safest possible path to the moon and back, a free return trajectory, meaning that even if every engine on the spacecraft had failed simultaneously, the moon's gravity would have swung them around and sent them falling toward Earth automatically. Just like Apollo 13 in 1970, in those 10 days, on this maximally conservative mission architecture, the cascade of anomalies began almost immediately. Day 1. The $30 million toilet broke. I am not being flippant. The waste management system aboard the Orion spacecraft cost approximately $30 million to develop. It is an engineering achievement in its own right. A zero-gravity waste management system designed to function in the unique environment of deep space, where liquids behave in ways that would horrify anyone who has ever used a bathroom on Earth, and where the consequences of a failure range from deeply unpleasant to genuinely hazardous. $30 million. And it broke on day 1. Shortly after launch, the system malfunctioned. One astronaut, the reports are deliberately vague about which one, took on the informal role of what NASA's own blog post described, with admirable restraint, as space plumber. The system was eventually restored to what the agency called go for you status. And after splashdown, NASA confirmed that the waste management system will require a full redesign for future missions. Day 1. Full redesign. Shortly after launch, the crew also experienced a loss of communications with mission control. For a period that has not been precisely disclosed, NASA was unable to receive telemetry data from the spacecraft, and the crew's voice transmissions were not getting through to Houston. The failure was asymmetric in a way that made it particularly unsettling. The astronauts could hear mission control, but mission control could not hear them. They were listening to instructions from a ground team that had no idea whether those instructions were being received, followed, or even heard. The most advanced crewed spacecraft ever built was flying toward the moon with a one-way phone line. Commander Wiseman also reported that his Microsoft Outlook email accounts were not functioning on the onboard computers. This sounds almost comically mundane compared to a heat shield with 100 cracks and a broken toilet. But it points to something real. The Orion spacecraft was designed and built over more than 15 years. The software systems aboard it, including the IT infrastructure that the crew uses for communication and scheduling, were specified years ago and integrated into a hardware environment that does not receive regular updates. When Outlook crashes on your laptop, you restart it. When Outlook crashes on a spacecraft 200,000 miles from Earth, NASA has to gain remote access to the onboard computers to fix it. And then there was the service module. The European service module, built by the European Space Agency, is the propulsion and life support backbone of the Orion spacecraft. After splashdown, NASA mission managers confirmed that the service module will require a valve redesign based on in-flight performance data. The details were limited. Which valve, what the anomaly was, how close it came to affecting the mission. But the fact that a redesign is required tells you that something operated outside expected parameters in a system responsible for keeping the crew alive. I want to be fair about something here, because fairness matters more than narrative. Test flights have anomalies. That is the entire point of a test flight, to find the things that do not work in the controlled environment of a real mission, so that you can fix them before the next one. Every Apollo mission had problems. Gemini missions had problems. The space shuttle's first flights had problems. Finding issues on Artemis II is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the test worked. But there is a difference between isolated anomalies and a pattern. A $30 million waste management system that failed on day one of a 10-day mission, a communication system that went asymmetric after launch, software that crashed, a propulsion module valve that needs a redesign, and underneath all of it, a heat shield that was never actually fixed, but was instead worked around with a modified trajectory that we would not know had succeeded until the post-flight inspection was complete. Each of these problems was individually manageable. Each of them was managed. The toilet was fixed. The comms were restored. The Outlook was debugged. The valve did not cause a mission failure. The crew came home. But when you step back and look at them together, when you see a spacecraft exhibiting this density of anomalies on a 10-day mission with 4 people aboard and a free return trajectory that would have brought them home regardless, you have to ask a question that the celebration does not invite you to ask. If this is the failure rate for 10 days, what is the failure rate for 30? For 90? For the 900 days of a round trip to Mars, where there is no free return trajectory, where mission control is 20 minutes away by radio, where you cannot splash down in the Pacific if things go wrong because the Pacific is approximately 55 million miles behind you? That question is the gap. The distance between a 10-day test flight with manageable anomalies and a multi-year expedition where every one of those anomalies becomes a potential catastrophe. The answer depends on a kind of math that NASA does very well, but does not always like to discuss publicly. The math of compound probability, where the chances of something going wrong do not add up linearly with mission duration, but multiply, where a 99% reliable system over 10 days becomes a 74% reliable system over 30 days, and a 36% reliable system over 100 days. The systems on Orion are far more reliable than 99%. But the principle holds. The longer you fly, the more failures you accumulate. And what Artemis II just showed us is what the baseline failure rate actually looks like for this particular spacecraft on its first crewed flight. It is not zero. It is not close to zero. It is a spacecraft operating at the absolute edge of human engineering capability, where $30 million toilets break and email does not work, and valves behave in ways that require a redesign. The crew came home safely from all of it. But the crew was only gone for 10 days. Here is what I want you to carry into everything that follows. Jim Free said the path to the lunar surface is open, and he said it standing in front of cameras, in a moment designed by a communications apparatus that has been perfecting the arts of translating complex engineering realities into digestible headlines for 60 years. The path to the lunar surface, open, now. Those are 7 words. They are clean and confident, and they fit on the front page of every newspaper that still has a front page. They are the kind of words you put on a poster. They are the kind of words that make parents point at the television and tell their children that anything is possible. They are not wrong. The path is, in some real sense, more open than it was 2 weeks ago. But the path has cracks in it. The path was built on a heat shield that cracked in unexpected ways on the test flight and was redesigned with a workaround that has now been flown once with humans in a configuration that had never before been tested at lunar return velocity. The path runs through a radiation environment that exceeded every pre-flight model by a margin that matters enormously when you start talking about longer missions. The path passes through a region of deep space where the biological cost of the journey is not measured in the weeks or months after landing, but in the decades after, in cardiovascular disease, in DNA damage, in things that will not become visible until the crew of Artemis II are in their 60s and 70s. And here is the thing about invisible things. They are still there. In the next part of the story, we are going to talk about a number that almost nobody mentioned during the celebration, 12 millisieverts. That is the radiation dose that each of the 4 Artemis II crew members absorbed during their 10 days beyond Earth's magnetic shield. And the reason that number matters, the reason it should fundamentally change how you think about everything NASA has said about the future of human deep space exploration, is not the number itself. It is what the number was supposed to be. The pre-flight models predicted 10.2 millisieverts. The actual reading was 12. That is approximately 18% higher than every simulation, every calculation, every model that NASA's radiation environment team produced in the years leading up to this mission. 18%. On a 10-day mission, that is a rounding error. On a 900-day mission to Mars, it is the difference between a crew that comes home and a crew that does not. But before we get there, before we follow that number to where it actually leads, I need to tell you about something that happened 4 decades ago to 12 men that nobody was watching closely enough. 12 men who went to the moon, came home to ticker tape parades, and then, in their 60s and 70s, started dying of heart disease at a rate that should have been impossible, 4 to 5 times the rate of astronauts who never left low Earth orbit. Same selection criteria, same fitness standards, same demographic, same era of medicine. One variable different: they went to the moon. There is a study that should have been front page news. It was published in 2016 in a journal called Scientific Reports by a researcher named Michael Delp at Florida State University. It was based on publicly available NASA mortality data. It used a straightforward methodology that any competent epidemiologist could replicate. The findings were, depending on your perspective, either the most important warning in the history of human spaceflight or a statistical artifact from a sample size too small to draw conclusions from. The problem is that both of those things might be true simultaneously. And the fact that we cannot tell the difference, the fact that 60 years into the human spaceflight program, after spending hundreds of billions of dollars sending people beyond Earth's atmosphere, We still do not have enough data to know whether the journey is slowly killing them is itself one of the most important things Artemis II revealed about our future in space. Let me walk you through what Delp found, because the architecture of the study matters as much as the conclusion. Delp and his colleagues took every NASA astronaut who had ever flown in space and divided them into 3 groups. Group 1. Astronauts who were selected for the program but never flew an orbital mission. These are people who went through the same grueling selection process, the same physical screening, the same psychological evaluation, but for various reasons, program cancellations, medical disqualifications, simple bad luck, never made it to space. Group 2. Astronauts who flew missions only in low Earth orbit, shuttle missions, ISS expeditions, Gemini, early Apollo tests that never left the safety of Earth's magnetic cocoon. Group 3. The Apollo lunar astronauts. 24 men, the only human beings in history before April 10th of 2026 to have crossed beyond Earth's magnetosphere and traveled through deep space. Delp's team tracked mortality data for all 3 groups, paying particular attention to cause of death. And when they sorted the numbers by cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, atherosclerosis, the full spectrum of conditions that kill more Americans than anything else, the results were not subtle. Non-flight astronauts, 9% cardiovascular disease mortality. Low Earth orbit astronauts, 11%. No statistically significant difference between those 2 groups. Flying in space, at least within the protected environment of low Earth orbit, did not meaningfully increase your risk of dying from heart disease. Which makes intuitive sense. These are extraordinarily healthy people, selected partly because their cardiovascular systems are in exceptional condition, monitored constantly, exercising rigorously. If anything, you would expect astronauts to have lower rates of heart disease than the general population, and indeed they do. Apollo lunar astronauts, 43% cardiovascular disease mortality, 4 to 5 times higher than either of the other groups. Not double, not slightly elevated, not a worrying trend worth monitoring. 4 to 5 times. Let me say that plainly, because I think the human brain has a natural defense mechanism against numbers. This stark, a tendency to assume that something so dramatic must have an obvious explanation, a confounding variable, a methodological flaw. So let me address those possibilities directly. Same selection criteria. The Apollo astronauts were not a physically inferior group. They were, if anything, the most elite physical specimens in the history of the program. Test pilots, military veterans, men who had demonstrated cardiovascular fitness under conditions of extreme stress, same demographic profile, same era, same access to medical care, same general lifestyle factors, the kinds of things that drive cardiovascular risk in the general population. The only variable that differed in any meaningful way between the group that died of heart disease at 43% and the group that died at 9 to 11% was this: the 43% group had traveled beyond Earth's magnetic shield. They had crossed the Van Allen radiation belts. They had spent days in the deep space radiation environment. They had absorbed galactic cosmic rays that the low Earth orbit astronauts, protected by the planet's magnetic field, had never encountered. Delp did not stop at the epidemiological data. He wanted a mechanism. If deep space radiation was causing elevated cardiovascular mortality, there had to be a biological pathway, a way that particles accelerated by distant supernovas were translating across decades into blocked arteries and failed hearts in men who had been among the healthiest human beings on the planet. So his team designed an animal study. They exposed mice to iron-ion radiation, heavy ion particles that simulate the galactic cosmic rays encountered beyond Earth's magnetosphere, and observed the effects on their vascular systems over time. After 6 months, which is roughly equivalent to 20 human years, the irradiated mice showed significant impairment of arterial function. Specifically, They exhibited damage to the vascular endothelium, the thin layer of cells that lines the interior of every blood vessel in the body. Endothelial dysfunction is the first step in a well-documented cascade that leads to atherosclerosis, hardening and narrowing of arteries, the primary cause of heart attacks and strokes. The proposed pathway is disturbingly elegant. Galactic cosmic radiation, the same radiation that passes through a spacecraft and its crew continuously during a deep space mission, damages the endothelial cells of blood vessels at the molecular level. The damage is subtle enough that it causes no immediate symptoms. The astronaut feels fine. The dosimeter reads within limits. The mission continues, but over decades, the accumulated endothelial damage progresses into full-blown cardiovascular disease at a rate that massively exceeds what you would expect from age, genetics, or lifestyle alone. The body does not announce this process. It does not send warnings. It simply accumulates damage in silence in the lining of blood vessels, one cosmic ray at a time, and waits. I want you to imagine something, and I want you to really inhabit it rather than let it slide past as an abstraction. You are one of the 12 Apollo astronauts who walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. You are in your late 20s or early 30s. You are in the best physical condition of your life. You have been selected from thousands of applicants for your health, your fitness, your intelligence, your ability to perform under pressure. You have trained for years. You have flown test missions and understood risks that most people cannot conceptualize. You are by any reasonable measure among the most prepared human beings who have ever lived. You fly to the moon. You walk on its surface. You look back at Earth from a distance that makes it small enough to cover with your thumb. You come home to a ticker tape parade and a place in history that is as permanent as anything a human being can achieve. And then in your 60s, you start having heart problems. Your arteries are hardening faster than your doctors expected. Your cardiovascular system, which was exceptional when you were selected for the program, is deteriorating in ways that do not match your age, your genetics, or your lifestyle. Your cardiologist looks at your scans and tells you that what he is seeing does not quite fit the usual pattern. You might not connect it to the moon. Why would you? The mission was decades ago. You feel fine most days. Everyone your age has health problems. The human body wears out. That is just how it works. But then Michael Dell publishes his study, and suddenly there is a number 43% that hangs over the Apollo lunar cohort, like a question that cannot quite be answered. Were you damaged by the mission that made you famous? Is the thing that defined your life also the thing that is shortening it? And if so, what does that mean for the 4 people who just came back from the same neighborhood? The Artemis II crew cannot answer that question today. They are healthy. They feel fine. Their dosimeters are within limits. But the Apollo data suggests that the answer may not arrive for 20, 30, or 40 years. It suggests that the biological cost of deep space radiation operates on a timescale that is fundamentally incompatible with the way we evaluate mission safety. We assess risk before the mission. We celebrate success after the mission. But the damage, if Delp's data is real, does not manifest until long after both the assessment and the celebration are distant memories. That is a readiness gap of a different kind. Not a gap in engineering or institutional behavior, but a gap in time. A gap between exposure and consequence. A gap that means we might be sending people into an environment that is damaging them in ways we will not be able to confirm until it is far, far too late to change course. Now I need to be honest with you about the limitations of this study, because honesty is the entire point. The Apollo sample size is extremely small. 24 total lunar astronauts. At the time of Delp's study, only 7 of them had died from cardiovascular disease. 7 deaths is a very small number from which to draw sweeping conclusions, Some researchers have questioned whether the 43% figure is statistically robust given the sample size. A 2018 follow-up study by different researchers looked at a broader cohort of astronauts and found elevated cardiovascular risk, but less dramatic numbers than Delp reported. The question is genuinely open. It has not been settled. And the fact that it has not been settled, is part of what makes it so concerning, because the reason it has not been settled is that the sample size has been too small. Only 24 human beings had ever been beyond Earth's magnetosphere. That is not enough people to run the kind of large-scale epidemiological study that would give you a definitive answer. You would need hundreds, ideally thousands, of deep space travelers to resolve the statistical uncertainty. Which brings us back to April 10, 2026. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen, the 25th through 28th human beings to travel beyond Earth's magnetosphere. They absorbed approximately 12 millisieverts of radiation over 10 days, 18% more than predicted, during one of the most active solar maxima in 2 decades. Blood samples were taken aboard Orion and will be analyzed for chromosomal damage, DNA breakage, and other biomarkers of radiation injury. The results will take months to process. The long-term cardiovascular effects, if Delp's findings are correct, will take decades to manifest. In the meantime, we are in a strange and uncomfortable position. We have enough data to be worried, but not enough to be certain. We have a 43% number from a small sample that might be a statistical fluke, or might be the most important warning sign in the history of human spaceflight. We have an 18% radiation overshoot from the first modern deep space dosimetry. And we have a program that is planning to send more and more people beyond the Van Allen belts, to the moon, eventually to Mars, on missions that are longer, with higher cumulative exposures, into a radiation environment that we just learned we understand about 18% less well than we thought we did. To understand why 12 millisieverts and an 18% overshoot should concern you, even though the crew is fine, even though the mission was a success, you need to understand what you are actually inside when you are in deep space, what the environment actually is, what is passing through the walls of your spacecraft and through your body, silently, continuously, in ways that no instrument can detect in real time. You live inside a force field. You have lived inside it every day of your life. You have never once felt it, or seen it, or thought about it. It is called the magnetosphere, and it is generated by the convection of molten iron in Earth's outer core, producing a magnetic field that extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space. That field deflects the vast majority of charged particles that stream to the solar system, protons, electrons, heavy ions, and channels them toward the poles where they produce the auroras. Without the magnetosphere, those particles would strike Earth's surface directly, strip the atmosphere over geological time, and irradiate every living thing on the planet. You are right now shielded by a magnetic bubble that has protected every organism on Earth for billions of years. The moment a spacecraft crosses beyond that bubble, the protection vanishes entirely. The International Space Station orbits at roughly 400 kilometers, well below the inner Van Allen belt, still inside the magnetosphere, still inside the shield. Astronauts on the ISS absorb elevated radiation compared to people on the surface, but they absorb it at a rate and with a particle composition that is fundamentally different from what you encounter beyond the magnetosphere. The ISS is dangerous in some ways, but it is not deep space. Deep space is something else entirely. In deep space, you are exposed to 2 primary categories of ionizing radiation. The first is solar energetic particles, bursts of protons and heavier ions accelerated by solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These are sporadic, sometimes violent, and impossible to predict more than a few hours in advance. The second is galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles originating from outside the solar system, accelerated by supernova remnants and other extreme astrophysical events that happened millions of years ago in distant corners of the galaxy. GCRs are constant. They do not surge and recede like solar particles. They are always there, always penetrating, and they carry energies that make them essentially impossible to shield against with any practical amount of material. There is a poet's cruelty to galactic cosmic radiation. It has been traveling for millions of years, accelerated by events that happened before our species existed, and it arrives at a human body with enough energy to break the bonds that hold DNA together. Not all at once, not in a dramatic burst that triggers an alarm, one particle at a time, one strand at a time, one cell at a time. The crew sleeps. The cosmic rays pass through them. The crew eats breakfast. The cosmic rays pass through them. The crew conducts experiments, takes photographs of the lunar surface, troubleshoots a broken toilet, argues about orbital mechanics, and the cosmic rays pass through them every second of every minute of every hour, leaving a trail of molecular damage so subtle that no instrument aboard the spacecraft can detect it in real time. GCRs include heavy ions, iron nuclei, for example, that carry enormous kinetic energy. When one of these ions passes through biological tissue, it does not just deposit energy along a narrow track the way a medical X-ray does. It shatters the DNA double helix. It creates clusters of damage, double-strand breaks, crosslinks, base deletions that the cell's repair machinery struggles to fix. When repair fails, the result is either cell death or, worse, a mutation that survives and replicates. That is how cancer begins. That is also, according to Delp's proposed mechanism, how cardiovascular disease begins, not through cancer, but through endothelial damage. The same heavy ions, the same tracks of destruction, the same silent accumulation. The damage is measured afterward, in blood draws, in chromosome analysis, in the long statistical arc of a career spent tracking biomarkers that might, decades from now, tell us whether 10 days in deep space left a permanent mark on the bodies of 4 otherwise healthy people. This is the part of spaceflight that does not make for good television. There is no explosion. There is no dramatic music. There is no moment of crisis that a ground team can respond to. There is just a number, 12 millisieverts, and a discrepancy, 18%, and a set of blood samples in a freezer somewhere, waiting to be analyzed. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people have not anticipated, because we do not have to speculate about what happens to human beings who travel beyond Earth's magnetic shield and absorb deep space radiation. We do not have to extrapolate from mouse studies or theoretical models. We have real data. It is 50 years old. It comes from the only other people who have ever done what the Artemis II crew just did, and what it shows is something that the space program spent decades not looking at closely enough. But the Apollo cardiovascular data is only the beginning of the biological story, because the Apollo astronauts spent, at most, 12 days in deep space. They had brief, intense exposures. They came home and recovered and lived their lives and apparently died of heart disease at rates that should have been impossible. The Artemis II crew spent 10 days, within safe limits, 18% above prediction. Now consider what happens when you scale those numbers. NASA maintains a career radiation exposure limit for astronauts of 600 millisieverts. That limit corresponds to roughly a 3% increase in lifetime cancer mortality risk, a policy threshold, not a biological absolute. There is no dose below which radiation is guaranteed safe. There is only a dose below which we have decided the risk is acceptable. The Artemis II crew absorbed 12 millisieverts in 10 days. 1 millisievert per day approximately, 18% above what every model predicted. A Mars mission lasts 900 days. 1 millisievert per day, which is already 18% below the reality Artemis II recorded. Over 900 days equals 900 millisieverts. That is 50% above NASA's career limit in a single mission. On the first trip, and that calculation does not include what Artemis II just demonstrated, that our models underestimate the actual exposure. It does not include the possibility of a solar particle event, a coronal mass ejection arriving without warning during the transit phase, adding hundreds of millisieverts in a matter of hours. It does not include the synergistic effects of radiation exposure, combined with the physiological degradation that every long-duration spaceflight causes in the human body. It does not include the 43%. The Apollo astronauts spent 12 days in deep space and apparently died of cardiovascular disease at 4 to 5 times the expected rate. What happens to people who spend 900 days there? We do not know. That sentence, "we do not know," is the most important sentence in this entire discussion. Not because it implies doom, not because it means Mars is impossible, or that the Artemis program is reckless, but because we do not know, and we are proceeding as though we do. We are declaring paths open in surfaces reachable and futures achievable, and a foundational biological question. What does deep space radiation actually do to the human body over the timescales we are discussing? Remains, in the most technical and rigorous sense, unanswered. There is an August in the story that most people have never heard about. August 1972. The Apollo 16 mission had returned to Earth in April. The Apollo 17 mission would launch in December. In between, in that 7-month window when no human being was beyond Earth's magnetic field, the sun did something extraordinary. On August 4th, 1972, the sun produced one of the most powerful solar particle events ever recorded. The event released a torrent of high-energy protons that, had they struck an unshielded human being in deep space, would have delivered an estimated dose of roughly 26 sieverts, not millisieverts, sieverts. A dose of 5 sieverts is considered universally lethal within weeks. Massive destruction of bone marrow, collapse of the immune system, organ failure in sequence. 26 sieverts would have killed an astronaut within hours. Apollo 16 returned in April. Apollo 17 launched in December. The August storm fell almost exactly in the middle of that gap. If either mission had been shifted by a few months, if Apollo 16 had launched late, if Apollo 17 had launched early, the crew would have been in deep space during the most lethal solar event of the 20th century. They would have died. There was no shielding on the Apollo command module that could have reduced a 26 sievert dose to survivable levels. There was no shelter protocol, no radiation bunker, no emergency procedure. They would have received a lethal dose within minutes, and they would have died in space, and there is nothing at all, that anyone could have done about it. This is not hypothetical speculation about a theoretical risk. This is a historical fact applied to a counterfactual timeline that missed reality by weeks. The crew of Apollo 16 and the crew of Apollo 17 are alive in our history books because of the specific dates on which their missions launched and returned. Change those dates by 60 days in either direction, and you change the history of the human species. Now apply the same sun, the same physics, the same unpredictability to Artemis II. The mission flew during solar cycle 25, near its peak. During the mission, radiation monitors aboard Orion recorded elevated electron flux for approximately 7 consecutive days. There was a G2 geomagnetic storm. An M7.5 solar flare erupted from an active sunspot region. On the day of re-entry, a G1 storm was still active. None of these events were catastrophic. The crew survived. The dosimeters registered 12 millisieverts, not 12 sieverts. They got lucky. Not because the mission was designed to avoid bad luck, not because the model said the probability was low enough to accept. Not because some engineering decision made the crew safe from an August 1972 class event, but because the Sun, in those 10 days, decided not to send one. Mission survival in deep space is still probabilistic, not controlled. That sentence should be printed on the wall of every conference room where Mars mission planning takes place. You can be lucky for 10 days. Being lucky for 900 is a different proposition entirely, and the math of probability says that over the course of a 3-year Mars mission, the chance of encountering at least one severe solar particle event, one genuinely dangerous burst of radiation that no luggage fort and no existing shielding technology can stop, is somewhere between 15 and 25%, depending on where you are in the solar cycle. 1 in 4. Roll a 4-sided die. If it comes up 1, your crew is in serious danger on a mission from which there is no early return. On flight day 8 of Artemis II, the crew built a fort. That is not a metaphor. They physically built a radiation shelter inside the Orion capsule. By repositioning equipment bags, water containers, and other dense materials to create an improvised shielding barrier around the sleeping area. The procedure is called HERA Human Exploration Radiation Assessment, and it involves using the mass of stored water, which contains hydrogen atoms that are relatively effective at absorbing certain types of radiation, to reduce dose rates for crew members in the immediate area. The shelter was needed because of the sustained radiation environment the crew had been flying through for 7 consecutive days. They assembled it, evaluated its effectiveness using onboard sensors, and confirmed that dose rates inside the shelter were measurably lower than outside. It helped, modestly. And here's the thing you need to understand about that shelter, about what it represents in the context of all the press releases and the NASA administrator's confident declaration and a standing ovation on the deck of the USS Portland. That shelter, that improvised arrangement of water bags and cargo pouches inside a $4 billion spacecraft, is the current state-of-the-art in human radiation protection for deep space. We build a fort out of luggage. We build it because we do not have active shielding technology. There is no electromagnetic field generator small enough and powerful enough to deflect galactic cosmic rays from a crewed spacecraft. There is no pharmaceutical countermeasure that prevents radiation damage to DNA in real time. There is no material light enough to launch into space that can block the full spectrum of deep space radiation without generating secondary particles, neutrons and other fragments that are themselves dangerous. The HERA shelter is not a solution. It is an acknowledgement. It is NASA saying, in the language of engineering, we know we cannot protect you from this environment, so here's the best we can do for now. The best we can do for now. For a 10-day mission, that is manageable. The shelter provided meaningful protection during one moderate solar particle event over 10 days. For a 900-day Mars mission, a crew would need protection not for one event, but for every event, plus the continuous background of galactic cosmic rays that never stops, never pauses, never waits for you to finish your breakfast. There is no fort made of luggage that solves that problem. And the 43% suggests there may not be a fort made of anything that solves it completely. Here is where the biological story and the engineering story converge into something that should genuinely keep you up at night. Artemis II returned data showing that the deep space radiation environment is 18% worse than our best models predicted. That is the first new real-world measurement we have obtained from beyond the Van Allen belts with modern instrumentation since the Apollo program ended in 1972. 50 years of model refinement, computational advancement, and satellite observation, and when we finally sent people out there again, with instruments good enough to measure what was actually happening, the reality came back 18% worse than every simulation said it would. That gap, that 18%, is not a crisis on a 10-day mission. The crew is fine. The dose was within limits. But here's the epistemological problem that should trouble everyone involved in planning future missions. if our best models are consistently 18% below reality, then every safety calculation, every career limit determination, every mission architecture decision that uses those models as inputs is built on a foundation that we now know to be systematically wrong in a single direction, not randomly wrong, not sometimes high and sometimes low, consistently, measurably, importantly low, 18% below reality. Every time someone sits down with a spreadsheet and calculates whether a proposed mission profile keeps the crew within acceptable radiation limits, they are working with numbers that Artemis II just demonstrated are consistently optimistic by nearly a fifth, and the Apollo cardiovascular data suggests that even the limits themselves, the career thresholds, the acceptable risk percentages, may be calibrated on an incomplete understanding of how deep space radiation actually damages the human body, because the 43% is not a radiation sickness number. It is not about people absorbing doses that exceeded immediate toxicity thresholds. The Apollo astronauts absorbed doses that were considered acceptable by the standards of the time, doses that their dosimeters recorded as safe, doses that were well within the career limits that existed then, and they died of heart disease at 4 to 5 times the expected rate anyway. Which means that within limits may not mean safe, which means that the limits may be wrong, which means that the entire framework we use to evaluate whether a mission is biologically acceptable for its crew may be built on assumptions that reality is in the process of contradicting. We do not know this for certain. The sample size is too small. The study has been questioned. The mechanism, while plausible, has not been definitively proven. But we are about to find out, because Wiseman and Glover and Koch and Hansen just became data points 25 through 28. The Artemis program is building the sample size that the DELP study needed and did not have. Every mission to the moon, every future crewed expedition beyond the magnetosphere, adds bodies and dosimetry readings and blood samples to a dataset that will, in 20 or 30 years, tell us definitively whether deep space radiation damages human cardiovascular systems at the rates the Apollo cohort suggests. By the time we know the answer, by the time the statistical picture is clear enough to be unambiguous, dozens or hundreds of people may have made the trip. We are running the experiment. The crew are the subjects. The results will not be available for decades. And the path to the lunar surface, Jim Free told us, is open now. There is a detail about the Artemis II radiation story that almost no one covered, and it points to something larger than the dosimetry numbers alone. The mission launched during solar cycle 25, which peaked around October 2024 with a smooth sunspot number of 161, one of the strongest solar maxima in recent decades. During solar maximum, the sun's increased activity actually modulates galactic cosmic rays slightly, pushing some of them away from the inner solar system. So the chronic background GCR dose during Artemis II was marginally lower than it would have been during solar minimum. But the trade-off is that the risk of a sudden acute solar particle event, a coronal mass ejection arriving with devastating speed and energy, is dramatically higher during solar maximum. During the same solar cycle, in May 2024, Earth experienced a G5 geomagnetic storm, the most intense in 2 decades, powerful enough to produce aurora visible from the tropics and to knock 40 Starlink satellites out of orbit. The Artemis II crew flew through that same solar environment. They were exposed to that same elevated risk. They carried dosimeters that measured the reality of that exposure, and the reality was 18% worse than the models. During solar maximum, you trade chronic radiation for acute risk. During solar minimum, you trade acute risk for chronic radiation. There is no window, no perfect timing, no ideal launch date where human beings traveling beyond Earth's magnetosphere are genuinely fully protected from what is out there. The universe is indifferent to our timelines. The sun does not consult our launch schedules. The galactic cosmic rays that have been traveling for millions of years do not slow down because we are not ready for them, and the biological cost of that reality, the cost that accumulates in endothelial cells and DNA strands in cardiovascular systems over years and decades, is the thing that no celebration, no matter how genuine or well-deserved, is designed to account for. The Artemis II crew is home. They are healthy. They broke a record that stood for 53 years, and in doing so, they became data points in a study that their grandchildren may be old enough to see the final results of. 12 millisieverts, 18% above prediction, 4 to 5 times elevated cardiovascular mortality in the only previous population that has done what they just did. These numbers are not. There's a concept in the sociology of disasters that most people have never heard of, but which explains more real-world catastrophes than almost any other idea in modern safety science. Diane Vaughan called it the normalization of deviance. Vallon is a sociologist at Columbia University, and she spent 8 years of her life submerged in millions of pages of internal NASA documents, meeting transcripts, engineering memoranda, and interoffice correspondence, trying to understand one deceptively simple thing: how an organization staffed by some of the most rigorous engineers on the planet could fly the space shuttle 24 times with O-ring seals that it knew were burning, not suspected, not feared, knew. The 24th shuttle flight launched with documented, photographic, signed and dated engineering evidence that O-ring erosion was occurring on previous missions. There were videos, there were photographs, there were reports with the names of engineers who had raised concerns, and the signatures of managers who had reviewed those concerns, and the dates on which the decisions to fly anyway had been recorded for posterity. Vaughan spent 8 years trying to understand the mechanism by which this documented, measured, undeniable danger was transformed, gradually, invisibly, institutionally, into an acceptable risk, and what she found was far more disturbing than any conspiracy or incompetence could have been. She found that NASA was not ignoring the problem. It was solving it over and over again in every flight using the only tool it had available: the repeated redefinition of what counted as normal. The first time an O-ring showed signs of thermal damage after a flight, it was an anomaly. Engineers worried. They documented it. They discussed it. They ran analysis and concluded that the level of damage did not exceed design margin thresholds. They flew again. The second time an O-ring showed damage, it was no longer a surprise. It had become expected. It had become part of how O-rings behaved. The degree of damage was compared not against zero, against the previous documented damage. Engineers said, "This is within previously observed parameters." They flew again. By the 24th flight, significant thermal distress on the O-rings had been reclassified from warning sign to standard operating condition. Not an alarm, not a caution, a baseline. A norm, the thing that happens and then you fly anyway. Vaughan called this process the normalization of deviance. A system that initially deviated from its ideal state gradually redefined that deviated state as the new ideal. Every successful flight reinforced the redefinition. If we flew with this level of damage and survived, then this level of damage must be acceptable. If we flew with greater damage and survived, then greater damage is acceptable too. If we flew in lower temperatures and survived, then lower temperatures are acceptable. On the evening before the Challenger launch, engineers at Thiokol called NASA. They said, "Do not fly." They said, "We have never launched at temperatures this low." They said, "The O-rings may fail." NASA managers asked them to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. That is a direct quote. Take off your engineering hats and put on your management hats. Challenger launched at 11:38 in the morning. It broke apart 73 seconds later. Now I want to tell you about the Avcode heat shield and about what NASA did and did not do after it failed. Orion first flew without a crew in December 2014, the Exploration Flight Test 1 mission. It was a brief suborbital test. Everything worked. The heat shield held. NASA celebrated. Then in November 2022, Artemis II sent Orion on a 25-day uncrewed lunar orbit, 720,000 kilometers, the first genuine full system test in real mission conditions. When Orion returned and was pulled from the Pacific Ocean and engineers began examining the heat shield, they found damage, not small cosmetic cracking, not the surface ablation the design models had predicted. More than 100 locations where the aft-coat material had separated in ways that did not match what any simulation had shown. This was an anomaly, documented, measured, undeniable. NASA conducted analysis. It determined that the material had been outgassing, releasing gases from the resin matrix during atmospheric entry in a way that laboratory testing had not captured. Real atmospheric entry was behaving differently from what the models said it would, and at this point a choice was made. Not a dramatic choice, not a choice where anyone sat in a room and consciously weighed a gamble against human lives. A quiet choice, a bureaucratic choice, the kind of choice that happens in committees, in memoranda, in technical risk management reviews, where people with charts on PowerPoint slides describe causal chains and failure probabilities. NASA determined that the cracking was not a critical safety defect. It determined that the outgassing phenomenon, while unexpected, did not compromise the heat shield's ability to protect a crew during entry. It determined that the 100-plus damaged sites were within acceptable bounds, not because the design had been validated against this failure mode, but because engineers analyzed the specific geometry of each crack and concluded that none of them, individually, would cause catastrophic shield failure. They did not redesign the heat shield. They modified the mission profile. They adjusted the entry angle slightly. They changed some procedures. They wrote reports, and they certified Orion for crewed flight. That certification produced Artemis II, and Artemis II returned with a heat shield that, by all accounts, performed adequately. The crew survived. The capsule was recovered. Jim Free stood on the deck of the USS Portland and said the path to the lunar surface is open. One flight, one data point, one success. Now here is the part that Diane Vaughn would recognize immediately. The avcoat cracking on Artemis I was an anomaly. An unexpected deviation from design predictions, something that should not have happened the way it did, and the institutional response to that anomaly, the analysis, the risk acceptance, the mission profile adjustment, the certification, was not negligence. It was exactly the kind of thorough, documented, professionally conducted engineering response that a safety culture is supposed to produce. But there is a difference between a thorough response and a correct one. And the distinction matters enormously, because one of the features of normalization of deviance is that it always arrives wearing the clothing of rigor. The memos look serious, the analysis looks comprehensive, the risk acceptance is documented and signed and reviewed, every box is checked. The process looks exactly like safety culture working the way it should, and then sometimes it isn't. The engineers who reviewed O-ring erosion data before Challenger were not cavalier. They were serious, experienced professionals who ran genuine analyses. The managers who approved continued flight were not reckless gamblers. They were working within an institutional framework that had developed over 24 flights, a calibrated sense of what was dangerous and what was manageable. The calibration was wrong, but it did not feel wrong. It felt like expertise. It felt like accumulated knowledge. It felt like the kind of hard-won understanding that only comes from experience. That is the most terrifying aspect of what Vaughn documented. The drift toward catastrophe does not feel like drift. It feels like progress. It feels like learning. It feels like an organization getting better at understanding its own systems. And by the time the drift has gone far enough that the illusion breaks, The correction is no longer available. You cannot unlaunch a shuttle. You cannot uncertify a heat shield. I want to introduce you to a man named Roger Boisjoly. Boisjoly was a senior engineer at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle. He was one of the engineers who called NASA on the evening of January 27, 1986, and said, "Do not fly." 6 months before that call, in July 1985, Boisjoly had written a memorandum to his supervisors. The memo is now famous. At the time it was filed and largely ignored. He wrote that the O-ring situation was serious enough, that if the problem were not corrected, they would face a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of crew and vehicle. He wrote those words 6 months before Challenger. He had the analysis, he had the data, he had the mechanism. He understood exactly what was going to happen if the organization continued to normalize the erosion data. He was right about everything, and it made no difference. After the accident, Boisjoly testified before the Presidential Commission investigating Challenger. He told them everything. He produced his memos. He described the phone call. He explained how management had overruled the engineers. He told the truth, completely and publicly, at significant personal cost. He was effectively blacklisted. Thiokol excluded him from meetings. His colleagues avoided him. He suffered a breakdown. He never worked in the aerospace industry again. I am not telling you this because NASA is an unusually villainous organization. I am telling you because it illustrates a dynamic that Vaughan identified as central to how institutional drift works. The organizations that normalize deviance are not populated by people who want to cause harm. They are populated by people who want the program to succeed, who believe the risks are manageable, who have convinced themselves through accumulated small decisions that the baseline they are working from is safe. And when someone inside the organization insists that the baseline is wrong, insists loudly, with evidence in writing, the organization does not typically say, "You are right, we must stop." It says you are not a team player. It says the analysis has been reviewed. It says, "We understand the risk better than you do, because we have been flying successfully for years, and you are treating an acceptable anomaly as a crisis." It says, "Put on your management hat." The pressure does not have to be explicit. It does not have to be a manager telling an engineer to ignore data. It can be as subtle as the institutional climate that forms around a program with momentum. The unspoken understanding that delays cost money, that cost overruns threaten the program's existence, that the people who raise concerns too loudly find themselves moved to less important roles, that the people who enable continued flight are the ones who get promoted. Vaughan called this the culture of production, the organizational imperative to keep flying, keep building, keep moving toward the goal, an imperative so deeply embedded in the institution's identity that it operates as a background pressure on every decision, every analysis, every risk acceptance, without ever needing to be stated explicitly. NASA in January 1986 had 11 astronauts waiting to fly. It had a manifest of 24 missions scheduled for that year. It had a congressional budget tied to demonstrating the operational cadence of the shuttle program. It had a teacher in space. It had cameras on the launch pad and a nation watching. It could not afford institutionally to let an engineering concern about O-ring temperature stop a launch. So it didn't. Now I want to take you to Columbia, because Vaughan's framework, developed to explain Challenger, turned out to be just as applicable 17 years later, which is itself a devastating indictment, not of NASA specifically, but of how organizational pathology works. It is not corrected by tragedy. It is not corrected by investigation reports and implementation plans. It persists, embedded in institutional structures and professional cultures, waiting for the next cycle of accumulated success to make the next round of deviance feel normal. Columbia launched on January 16, 2003. During launch, a piece of foam insulation broke off from the external tank and struck the leading edge of the left wing at approximately 800 kilometers per hour. The foam strike was captured on camera. NASA engineers knew about it before the mission was a day old. What happened next is one of the most thoroughly documented institutional failures in engineering history. The foam had struck previous shuttle orbiters, not once, not twice, 113 times before Columbia. Foam had separated from the external tank during ascent. It had damaged tiles. It had damaged the leading edges. On every previous occasion, the orbiter had survived. On every previous occasion, engineers had analyzed the damage, compared it to previous incidents, concluded it was within acceptable parameters, and the mission had continued. By the time Columbia launched, foam shedding was not an alarm. It was a known phenomenon with a documented history of not being catastrophic. The debris team that analyzed the strike on Columbia was not staffed by people who were ignoring danger. They were staffed by people who had seen foam strikes before, who had developed analytical methods for evaluating foam strikes, who were working within a framework that had been calibrated across 113 previous missions. The calibration was wrong. The foam that struck Columbia's wing damaged the reinforced carbon-carbon panels on the leading edge in a way that created a breach. The breach allowed superheated plasma to enter the wing structure during atmospheric entry on February 1, 2003. The wing failed. The orbiter broke apart over Texas and Louisiana. 7 astronauts died. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, in its final report, identified the cause of the accident not as a technical failure alone, but as organizational. The board wrote that NASA's organizational culture and structure were as much a cause of the accident as the foam strike itself. It identified the same pattern that Vaughn had documented in Challenger, the normalization of a risk that was known but had been reclassified through repeated successful outcomes, from warning to baseline. The board explicitly cited Vaughn's work. It said her framework applied directly. It said that NASA had not learned what it needed to learn from Challenger, because the lesson Challenger required was not about O-rings. It was about the institutional processes through which organizations convince themselves that known risks are manageable. That lesson is harder to learn than any engineering lesson. Engineering lessons produce design changes. You look at what broke and you fix it. The lesson Challenger and Columbia together were trying to teach was not about what broke. It was about how an organization comes to define what counts as broken. And that lesson requires an organization to examine not its hardware, but its culture, its incentives, its communication structures, its decision-making hierarchies, the invisible pressures that shape which voices get heard and which get filed. NASA produced reports. It created new oversight bodies. It implemented new processes. And then, in 2004, President George W. Bush announced the vision for space exploration, a new program to return humans to the moon. The program was eventually canceled, restructured, renamed Constellation, then canceled again, then restructured into Artemis. Through all of it, the organizational dynamics that Vaughn described, the culture of production, the normalization of deviance, the institutional pressure to enable continued flight never went away. They cannot go away. They are not a feature of NASA specifically. They are a feature of any large organization that operates at the boundary of known technical capability, under budget pressure, schedule pressure, and the accumulated weight of previous success. Let me describe for you in precise detail the process by which the Avcut heat shield problem was managed after Artemis I, not because I have access to internal NASA documents that have not been made public. I don't. But because the publicly available information, read through the lens of what Vaughn spent her career documenting, tells a story with a recognizable shape. The damage to the Avcut was discovered and documented. An anomaly review team was convened. Engineers analyzed each of the more than 100 damaged sites individually. They modeled the outgassing mechanism. They assessed the structural implications. They determined that the specific geometry of the cracking, the depth, the width, the location relative to areas of peak heating, did not produce a failure mode that would compromise the heat shield's protective function. This analysis was reviewed, it was signed off, it was incorporated into the flight certification for Artemis II. The heat shield was not redesigned because redesigning it would have required significant delays and significant cost. A full heat shield redesign with the testing program it would require could have pushed Artemis II back by years. The program's schedule, its budget profile, its political support in Congress, its relationship with the international partners who had committed to the Gateway program, all of these things exert gravitational pull on the decision about whether to fly with the existing shield or stop and fix it. None of this means the engineers who certified Artemis II were wrong. Their analysis may have been entirely correct. The heat shield may have been completely adequate. The Artemis II crew came home, the heat shield performed. But here's what the Challenger and Columbia investigations teach us. The question is not whether the analysis was correct this time. The question is whether the process by which a known anomaly was reclassified as an acceptable condition is a process we trust to remain correct across multiple missions, in multiple environments, under conditions we have not yet encountered, because the environment will change. The missions will get longer. The vehicles will accumulate flight cycles. The heat shield that performed adequately on a 10-day lunar flyby will face different conditions on a mission that goes into lunar orbit, that spends more time maneuvering, that re-enters at a slightly different angle on a slightly different trajectory under slightly different thermal loads. And when that happens, when some combination of factors produces a condition that falls outside the envelope the engineers used to certify the existing design, the question will be, did the one successful flight of Artemis II provide sufficient basis to trust this shield in conditions it has never seen? One flight, one data point, one success. There's a phrase in aviation safety that applies here. The phrase is the accident chain. Aviation accident investigators long ago recognized that catastrophic failures almost never result from a single cause. They result from a chain of smaller failures, individually manageable, collectively lethal. An instrument misreads. A crew fails to cross-check. A weather briefing misses a detail. A maintenance procedure is not fully completed. Each link in the chain, alone, would not have caused the crash. The chain is what kills. The reason this framing matters is that it reorients the investigation. Instead of asking what broke, it asks what sequence of small normalizations, small acceptances of slightly elevated risk, small redefinitions of the baseline created the conditions under which a single additional stress was enough to tip the system into catastrophe. When you look at the Artemis program through this lens, you see not a single alarming data point, but a chain in formation. The heat shield cracked on Artemis I in more than 100 locations in ways the models did not predict. The anomaly was analyzed, accepted, and the mission profile was adjusted rather than the design corrected. Link 1. The radiation environment on Artemis II was 18% worse than every model predicted. The crew was within limits. The measurement was documented. The models will presumably be updated, but the fact that the best available models were systematically wrong in a single direction, consistently optimistic about one of the most consequential hazards in deep space travel, means that every safety calculation built on those models was built on a foundation we have just learned is not trustworthy. Link 2. The Apollo lunar astronauts died of cardiovascular disease at 4 to 5 times the expected rate. The sample size is too small to be definitive. The study has been questioned. The mechanism, while plausible, is unproven, but the signal exists, and it points in a direction that is consistent with what we know about deep space radiation biology, and the response of the space medicine community has been not to resolve the question, but to note the uncertainty and continue planning missions. Link 3. The Artemis program is planning to increase mission duration, increase crew size, and extend human presence in deep space at a pace that the biological data cannot keep up with. The results of the blood samples taken aboard Artemis II will not be available for months. The cardiovascular data on the Artemis II crew will not be meaningful for decades. The program will have sent dozens more people beyond the magnetosphere before the data from the first modern deep space crewed mission is even partially understood. Link 4. None of these links, individually, constitutes a crisis. All of them, together, constitute a pattern that anyone who has read Vaughn's work would recognize immediately. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying, because precision matters and the topic is serious enough that imprecision would be a kind of dishonesty. I am not saying that Artemis II should not have flown. I am not saying that the AVCODE certification was wrong. I am not saying that the Artemis program is reckless or that the people who run it are negligent. The opposite of all of those things is closer to the truth. The people who work on Artemis are serious, capable, and deeply committed to the safety of their crews. The program has produced genuine achievements. The Artemis II crew came home safely, and that is not a small thing. What I am saying is something more specific. I am saying that the same organizational dynamics that Vaughn identified, the incremental reclassification of known anomalies as acceptable, the accumulation of successful missions as evidence that the current baseline is safe, the institutional pressure to enable continued flight rather than stop and fix, the gap between the story the organization tells about its safety and the reality underneath, are present in the Artemis program in ways that are visible if you look at the data. And I am saying that the history of spaceflight provides no examples of a program that successfully identified this dynamic in itself in advance of an accident. Every program that has fallen to normalization of deviance has been identified afterward, from the outside, by investigators examining the wreckage. The shuttle program flew 24 flights with burning O-rings before Challenger. It flew 113 flights with foam strikes before Columbia. Both programs had safety cultures. Both programs had review processes. Both programs had engineers who raised concerns. Both programs had documentation trails that would later be read as obvious warning signs by people who already knew what they were looking for. The documentation exists for Artemis II. It is in the Artemis I anomaly reports. It is in the Artemis II dosimetry data. It is in the DELP study and the follow-up studies that confirmed elevated cardiovascular risk and the follow-up studies that question the sample size and the ongoing uncertainty that sits like a weight on top of the entire enterprise. The difference, the only difference that matters, is that we are reading this documentation now, before the accident rather than after. There's a man named Bob Ebeling who deserves to be remembered. Ebeling was another Thiokol engineer. He was in the room when the decision to launch Challenger was made. He was one of the men who argued against it. He lost the argument. He watched Challenger explode on television the next morning. For the rest of his life, Ebeling believed that the accident was his fault, not the managers who overruled him, not the institutional dynamics that made the overruling possible. His fault. Personally, he had known what was going to happen. He had said so, and 7 people had died anyway. He gave one interview, 30 years after the accident, shortly before his own death. He was 91 years old. He said that he had failed. He said the decision still haunted him. He said he had nightmares about it still. 3 decades later, the reporter who interviewed him shared the response from the public after the story ran. Hundreds of people wrote to say that it was not his fault, that he had done everything he could, that the system had failed, not him. Ebeling was not comforted. He said that he appreciated the kind words, but that they did not change what he knew. He had known what was going to happen. He had said so, and it had happened anyway. I think about Bob Ebeling when I read the DELP study. I think about him when I read the Artemis I anomaly reports. I think about him when I read the dosimetry data from Artemis II and the phrase 18% above prediction sits on the page with no alarm attached to it, no protocol triggered, no mission paused. Somewhere in NASA today there are engineers who know things. There are doctors who know things. There are radiation biologists and cardiovascular researchers and material scientists who have read the same data I have read and who understand it at a depth I cannot match. And some of them are worried. Not all of them, I have no way of knowing which ones, but some of them. And the question that history poses with brutal consistency is not whether those people exist. It is whether the institution they work for will hear them before or after it matters. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's report ends with a sentence that has been quoted many times and absorbed very few. It says that the board strongly believes that if NASA does not fundamentally alter the way it develops, operates, and manages its programs, and if the institution does not address the underlying organizational causes revealed in this accident, it is difficult to understand how the agency can operate in a manner that ensures crew safety. The board issued that finding in August 2003. NASA implemented many of the specific recommendations. It created the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance with enhanced authority. It established new debris impact monitoring requirements. It developed new rescue procedures. It returned the shuttle to flight in 2005. And then in 2011 it retired the shuttle entirely. The program ended not because of a safety concern, but because of budget constraints and the political decision to shift resources toward a new lunar architecture. The organizational lessons, the culture-level lessons about how institutions process risk, about how production pressure shapes safety decisions, about how successful flights become evidence of safety rather than evidence of luck, were never definitively solved because they cannot be definitively solved. They can only be managed continuously by people who remain vigilant about exactly the dynamics that successful programs are designed to make invisible. The Artemis program is a successful program. It has international partners. It has a flight manifest. It has a political constituency. It has billions of dollars of infrastructure built around it. It has the momentum of an institutional identity tied to returning humans to the moon for the first time in more than 50 years. It also has a cracked heat shield that was certified after analysis rather than redesigned. It has a radiation environment that is 18% worse than its models predicted. It has a biological signal from the only previous population of deep space travelers that is, at minimum, alarming enough to warrant a definitive answer before we send dozens more people into the same environment. These two things, the program's genuine achievements and its unresolved risks, exist simultaneously. Celebrating one does not make the other disappear, and the history of human spaceflight suggests, with the clarity of tragedy, that the institutional tendency is to let the celebration crowd out the concern, one successful flight at a time, until the concern becomes impossible to ignore for the worst possible reason. The Artemis II crew is home. They are healthy. They feel fine. The O-rings on 24 previous shuttle flights had also, by any post-flight measure, performed. The foam on 113 previous shuttle flights had also, by any post-flight measure, not caused a catastrophic accident. One flight, one data point, one success. The pattern does not announce itself, it accumulates. There is a thought experiment that physicists use when they want to illustrate the counterintuitive nature of probability. Imagine a gun with 1,000 chambers and one bullet. You pull the trigger, nothing happens. You pull it again, nothing happens. You pull it 998 more times, nothing happens. Does the 1,001st pull become safer because of everything that came before it? Obviously not. The probability resets with every pull. The gun does not remember its history. The bullet does not move because you have been lucky. But human beings are not built to think this way. Human beings are built to learn from experience. And experience says, I pulled the trigger 1,000 times and survived. Therefore, the gun is probably not loaded, or the bullet is probably a dud, or I am probably doing something right. Experience says 1,000 successful outcomes is evidence of safety. Probability says it is evidence of nothing except that you have been lucky 1,000 times. And the 1,001st pull is exactly as dangerous as the first. This tension between what experience teaches and what probability actually means is at the heart of every institutional disaster that has ever been documented. It is at the heart of Challenger. It is at the heart of Columbia. And it is at the heart of something that has not happened yet, but that the data, read carefully and without the distortion of celebration, suggests may be approaching. The Artemis program is pulling the trigger. Every mission is a pull. The gun is the deep space environment, the radiation, the solar particle events, the heat shield, the 100 interlocking systems that must all function correctly for a crew to come home. And the question that the data from Artemis II raises, quietly and without drama, is not whether we have been lucky so far. Of course we have been lucky so far. The question is whether we understand the gun well enough to know how many bullets are in it. The answer, if you read the dosimetry data and the Apollo cardiovascular studies in the Avcoat anomaly, reports without the filter of institutional optimism, is we do not. We know less than we thought we knew. We know it in specific, measurable ways, and we're proceeding anyway, on a schedule driven not by what the biology can tell us, but by what the budget and the politics and the manifest require. I want to tell you about what happens to a human body in deep space on a timescale that no mission report captures, not the acute effects, the nausea, the fluid shift toward the head, the visual disturbances from cosmic rays passing through the retina that Apollo astronauts described as flashes of light even with their eyes closed. Those effects are real and documented and worth understanding, but they are the visible surface of a much deeper biological process. I want to tell you about what happens at the molecular level, in the dark, in the weeks and months and years after a crew comes home. When a charged particle, a galactic cosmic ray, a heavy ion, an accelerated proton from a solar flare, passes through biological tissue, it does not politely deposit its energy and move on. It ionizes the atoms it encounters, stripping electrons and creating free radicals, chemically reactive molecules that attack the structures around them with indiscriminate violence. DNA, cell membranes, proteins, the mitochondrial machinery that powers every cell in the body, all of it is vulnerable. The human body has repair mechanisms for this kind of damage. Evolution has had billions of years to develop them, because ionizing radiation has always existed on Earth's surface at low levels, and organisms that could not repair radiation damage did not survive to reproduce. The mechanisms are sophisticated. They are fast. They work. But they work within a range. They are calibrated for the radiation environment that exists inside Earth's magnetic shield, where the daily dose is low enough that repair keeps pace with damage. In deep space, the dose rate and the particle composition are outside the range that Earth's biology evolved to handle. Heavy ions in particular, iron nuclei, silicon nuclei, particles with energies that no medical radiation source can replicate, create damage patterns that the repair machinery was never designed for. A medical X-ray creates damage along a diffuse path through tissue. The damage is spread out, individual strand breaks, and the repair machinery handles it efficiently. A galactic cosmic ray heavy ion creates a dense column of destruction. A track through the tissue where everything within a few nanometers of the particle's path is shattered simultaneously. Double strand breaks, cross links, base deletions, all clustered together in a pattern that the repair machinery cannot easily parse. When repair fails, two things can happen. The cell can die, which is bad in proportion to how many cells die simultaneously, but is not catastrophically dangerous at the doses involved in a mission like Artemis II. or the cell can survive with a mutation, a change in its DNA that alters its behavior in ways that may not manifest for years or decades. This is how cancer develops. A single cell, damaged and improperly repaired, acquires a mutation that disrupts the normal control of cell division. The mutation confers a growth advantage. The cell replicates. Its daughters replicate. Years later, a tumor appears in tissue that was, to all external measurement, healthy on the day the astronaut splashed down. The latency is the thing that makes this so difficult to study, so difficult to communicate, and so easy to ignore. There is no instrument that measures future cancer risk. There is no blood test that reveals the mutational burden accumulated during a 10-day mission and projects it forward 30 years. The damage is real, measurable in indirect ways. Chromosome aberrations, DNA strand break markers, oxidative stress biomarkers. But its ultimate clinical expression is invisible at the moment it is inflicted. The astronaut comes home and feels fine. The post-mission medical evaluation finds nothing alarming. The dosimetry is reviewed and filed. The blood samples go into storage, and somewhere in the body, in a cell that no instrument is watching, the process that will eventually matter has already begun. Scott Kelly spent 340 days on the International Space Station. His identical twin, Mark, stayed on Earth. NASA studied both of them. The most comprehensive longitudinal study of spaceflight's biological effects ever conducted, using the identical genetic baseline of monozygotic twins to isolate the variables that space introduces. The results were published in 2019 in Science, and they were illuminating in ways that went beyond what any press release communicated. Scott's telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, whose length is associated with cellular aging and longevity, actually lengthened during spaceflight. This was unexpected. Telomeres normally shorten with age and stress. Their lengthening in space was initially reported as a curious positive finding. Then Scott came home. Within 48 hours of return, his telomeres began shortening rapidly. Within months, they were shorter than his twins. The spaceflight-induced lengthening had reversed and overcorrected, leaving Scott's chromosomes in a state of accelerated apparent aging relative to a baseline that had been identical before the mission. His cognitive performance showed measurable declines in certain domains that had not fully recovered a year after landing. His microbiome shifted significantly and took months to partially restabilize. Gene expression patterns, the actual activation and deactivation of genes in his cells, the biological software that runs every cellular function, showed changes in more than 7% of the genes that were tested. Most of those changes returned toward baseline after 6 months. Some did not. The headline for most of the coverage was, "Scott Kelly came back from space mostly fine," which is accurate. He is alive and functional, and by most measures healthy. But the subtext of the data, read by people who understand what they are looking at, is something more sobering. 340 days in low Earth orbit, still inside the magnetosphere, still partially shielded, produced measurable changes in gene expression, telomere dynamics, cognitive function, gut microbiome composition, and multiple other biological systems, some of which had not fully resolved a year after landing. Scott Kelly was in low Earth orbit. He was not in deep space. He was not beyond the magnetosphere. He was not exposed to the full spectrum of galactic cosmic radiation. He was not in the environment that Artemis II's crew just inhabited. The Artemis II crew spent 10 days beyond the magnetosphere. The Kelly twin study suggests that the biological effects of spaceflight are more pervasive and more persistent than the conventional post-mission medical evaluation captures. What the Kelly study cannot tell us, what no study has yet told us, because no one has done the equivalent study for deep space, is what the biological signature of deep space radiation looks like in the gene expression data, the telomere dynamics, the microbiome composition of people who spent 10 days beyond the Van Allen belts. We will find out. The samples from Artemis II are in storage. The analysis will take months. The follow-up studies will take years. The cardiovascular data, if Delp's findings are real, will take decades. In the meantime, the program continues. There is a man named Frank Borman who died in 2023, and I think about him sometimes when I try to understand what we are asking of the people who fly these missions. Borman was the commander of Apollo 8, the first mission to leave Earth's orbit, the first mission to reach the moon, the mission that produced the Earthrise photograph that many people consider the most important photograph ever taken. He was one of the 3 human beings who, on Christmas Eve 1968, read from the book of Genesis while orbiting the moon at a distance that made the entirety of human civilization visible in a single glance. He spent nearly 7 days beyond Earth's magnetosphere. He absorbed whatever dose the deep space radiation environment delivered in those 7 days. He came home. He left NASA and went on to a successful career running Eastern Airlines. He lived to be 95 years old and died of natural causes, not cardiovascular disease. Borman is one reason that Delp's findings should be held with appropriate uncertainty. 24 is a small sample. Some of those men lived to old age without cardiac events. The 43% figure is an aggregate, not a sentence pronounced on every individual. Biology is variable. Some people are more resistant to radiation-induced cardiovascular damage than others. Genetics, lifestyle, baseline health, individual variation in DNA repair capacity. All of these things modulate the relationship between exposure and outcome, but here's what Borman's long life does not tell us. It does not tell us that deep space radiation is safe. It tells us that some individuals survive deep space radiation exposure without apparent cardiovascular sequelae. The relevant question is not whether everyone who goes to deep space will develop early cardiovascular disease. The relevant question is whether the rate of cardiovascular disease in the population that goes to deep space is elevated above what it would otherwise be, and on that question, Borman's longevity is a single data point in a distribution whose shape we do not yet understand well enough to trust. The same logic applies to every positive outcome from early spaceflight. Every Apollo astronaut who lived to a healthy old age is sometimes used implicitly as evidence that deep space radiation is not as dangerous as the Delp study suggests, but that is not how epidemiology works. That is not how risk works. That is how pattern recognition in humans works. We see the survivor and we update our estimate of safety, when the correct update is to add one data point to a distribution and note that the distribution still has too few points to be definitive. What we are building with every Artemis mission is a larger sample. The distribution is growing. The statistical picture is becoming clearer, at a pace determined by how many people we send and how many years we wait for the results. And the decision about how many people to send is being made before the results from the first people are in. Let me tell you about the economics of this problem, because the economics are part of the story in a way that does not get discussed enough. The Artemis program costs approximately $4 billion per year in its current form. The Space Launch System, the rocket that launched Artemis II, costs approximately $4.1 billion per launch. A single launch of the SLS costs more than the entire annual budget of the National Cancer Institute. It costs more than the entire annual budget of NASA's Science Mission Directorate, which funds every planetary science mission, every space telescope, every Earth observation satellite the agency operates. This is not an argument against Artemis. Human spaceflight has value that cannot be entirely captured in a cost-benefit spreadsheet. The technological development it drives, the inspiration it generates, the geopolitical signal it sends, these are real, even if they are difficult to quantify. The economics create a gravitational field around the program that shapes every decision within it. When an engineer proposes stopping to redesign the Avcode heat shield, the economic weight of what that means presses down on the conversation before the first technical objection is raised. Redesigning the heat shield means delays. Delays mean cost overruns. Cost overruns mean congressional hearings. Congressional hearings mean program vulnerability. Program vulnerability means jobs in key districts are at risk. The chain of consequence runs from a material anomaly in a test article to the political survival of the program itself, and everyone in the room understands that chain even when it is never spoken aloud. This is not corruption. It is not even irrationality, in the narrow sense that each individual link in the chain is a reasonable inference. It is a structural feature of how large government programs work. The way that institutional inertia and economic momentum combine to create a force that is not malicious, but is, in aggregate, a pressure toward continued flight. Roger Pielko Jr., a policy scholar who has studied NASA extensively, has written about what he calls the space program's institutional commitment to mission. His argument is that programs like Artemis develop a logic of their own, a momentum that makes stopping or significantly redirecting the program feel, to the people inside it, like a form of institutional death. The program's survival becomes entangled with its mission's success in ways that make safety concerns feel like existential threats to something larger than any individual mission. This is not a new observation. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board made a version of it. Feynman made a version of it in his famous appendix to the Challenger Commission report, where he wrote that NASA management appeared to be willing to fly shuttle at estimated failure rates 100 times higher than those cited by engineers, and that this reflected a kind of management attitude that said that reality must be adjusted to match the schedule rather than the schedule adjusted to match reality. For a successful mission, he wrote, NASA needs to accept only those risks that are understood and acceptable. And the only way to know whether a risk is understood and acceptable is to understand it, not to accept it because understanding it would be inconvenient. The radiation environment on Artemis II was 18% above prediction. We did not understand it as well as we thought. The heat shield on Artemis Ace cracked in more than 100 locations in ways no model predicted. We did not understand it as well as we thought. The cardiovascular effects of deep space radiation remain unresolved 40 years after the population that could resolve them first flew. We do not understand them, and the program is proceeding. I want to take you somewhere unexpected now. I want to take you to the bottom of the ocean. In 1963, the USS Thresher, a nuclear submarine, sank during deep dive testing in the North Atlantic. 129 men died. The Navy investigated. It found that a failure in a seawater pipe system had caused flooding, which led to a loss of power, which prevented the crew from blowing the ballast tanks to surface. The ship imploded at depth. The investigation also found something else. It found that the culture of submarine construction and testing had developed over years of successful operations, a tolerance for small deficiencies in manufacturing standards, joint integrity, and testing protocol. Each individual deficiency had been assessed and accepted. The aggregate of accepted deficiencies had created a system that failed when stressed in ways that testing had never captured. The Navy's response was SubSafe, a submarine safety program that applied rigorous quality requirements to every component in a submarine's pressure hull and critical systems. The requirements were strict. They added time and cost. They were resisted by some in the Navy as excessive given the historical success rates. The program has been in place for more than 60 years. In that time, with more than 900 submarines built or overhauled under subsafe requirements, the United States Navy has not lost a single submarine to a hull or system failure. Not one. The contrast with non-subsafe systems is instructive. The USS Scorpion, which sank in 1968, was not fully subsafe compliant. 99 men died. Subsafe works because it treats safety not as a condition to be certified once and trusted thereafter, but as a continuous property that must be actively maintained against the entropy of institutional drift. It works because it is deliberately resistant to the economic and schedule pressures that would otherwise erode it. It works because the Navy decided after Thresher that the cost of maintaining the program was worth paying, regardless of how many successful dies accumulated without incident. There is no equivalent of subsafe for deep space radiation. There is no equivalent of subsafe for the Avcoat heat shield anomaly. There is no program whose explicit purpose is to resist the institutional pressure to normalize the knowns of deep space travel and insist on resolution before the next crew launches. There is astronaut health monitoring. There is radiation dosimetry. There is a framework of career limits and acceptable risk thresholds, but the framework was calibrated on an incomplete understanding of deep space radiation biology, and Artemis II just demonstrated that the physical environment is worse than the models predicted, and the Apollo cardiovascular data suggests that the biological effects may be worse than the limits assume. The framework is the answer to a question that the data is in the process of revising. I want to be honest with you about something that most of the coverage of Artemis does not say. The people who make the decisions I have been describing are not villains. They are not reckless. They are not indifferent to the lives of the people they are sending into space. The engineers at NASA who certified the Avcoat heat shield, the flight surgeons who cleared the Artemis II crew, the administrators who declared the path to the lunar surface open. These are serious, careful, intelligent people who have dedicated their careers to exactly the goal of sending human beings beyond Earth's atmosphere and bringing them home alive. The problem with normalization of deviance, as Vaughn documented so carefully, is that it does not require bad actors. It requires good actors operating within a system whose incentive structure gradually, invisibly, bends their judgment in a single direction. The good actors do not notice the bend. It happens slowly, one small decision at a time, one accepted anomaly at a time, one successful flight at a time. And the bending is not random. It always bends in the same direction, because the institutional incentives always pull in the same direction. The incentive to fly is enormous. The incentive to stop and fix is, in any given moment, much smaller, because stopping and fixing is expensive and disruptive and politically costly, and stopping and fixing does not produce the kind of visible, demonstrable, celebratable outcome that a successful mission does. No one throws a parade for the mission that didn't fly because an engineer raised a concern and was taken seriously. No one holds a press conference to announce that NASA is delaying its lunar landing by 2 years to resolve an anomaly in the heat shield certification process. No one builds an exhibit in a museum for the crew that was protected from a radiation environment we do not yet fully understand by a program that insisted on understanding it before sending them. These things are invisible when they work. They are only visible when they fail, and when they fail, the visibility is catastrophic. Here's what we know, stated without hedging or qualification. We know that the deep space radiation environment encountered by the Artemis II crew was 18% worse than the best available models predicted. We know this because we measured it with instrumentation that was not available during Apollo. We know that this discrepancy is not a rounding error. 18% is a meaningful underestimate of a hazard that accumulates over the entire duration of every future mission. We know that the only other population of human beings who have traveled beyond Earth's magnetosphere died of cardiovascular disease at rates that were 4 to 5 times higher than comparable groups who did not make that journey. We know that the sample size is small. We know that the finding has been questioned. We know that it has not been refuted, resolved, or explained away. And we know that the explanation, if Delt's proposed mechanism is correct, is biologically coherent and consistent with animal model data showing that simulated deep space radiation causes exactly the kind of vascular endothelial damage that precedes cardiovascular disease. We know that the heat shield of the Orion capsule cracked in more than 100 locations on its first unscrewed lunar mission in ways that the design models did not predict. We know that the anomaly was analyzed and accepted rather than redesigned and resolved. We know that the heat shield performed on Artemis II's crewed mission. We know that one successful flight does not validate a design against every condition it will encounter in future missions with longer durations and different trajectories. We know that the Artemis program's schedule calls for increasing mission duration, increasing the number of missions, and eventually supporting human presence at the Lunar Gateway, a station in a near rectilinear halo orbit that, unlike the ISS, will be partially exposed to the deep space radiation environment essentially continuously. We know that the biological data required to make informed decisions about crew health on those missions will not be available before the missions fly. We know that NASA's career radiation exposure limit of 600 millisieverts, a policy threshold, not a biological absolute, was calibrated against cancer risk models and does not account for cardiovascular disease risk because the cardiovascular signal from the Apollo data was not fully documented or analyzed until decades after those limits were set. We know that if DELP's findings are real, the limits may be protective against acute radiation sickness and cancer while being entirely inadequate protection against the cardiovascular mechanism that may be the primary long-term killer. We know all of this. It is all in the public record. It is all documented, published, accessible to anyone willing to read it without the filter of the press release or the mission success headline, and we're proceeding anyway. I want to tell you about a concept called decision latitude because it explains something about why the situation I have been describing is not simple to fix. Decision latitude is the degree to which individuals within an institution have the authority and the practical ability to stop a process they believe is unsafe. High decision latitude means any individual on the production line can halt a process if they identify a safety concern. Low decision latitude means the authority to stop is concentrated at the top of a hierarchy, where the people who hold the authority are also the people most exposed to the institutional pressures that favor continued production. The Challenger launch decision involved extremely low decision latitude. The engineers who believed the O-rings would fail had no authority to stop the launch. The managers who had the authority to stop it were the people most exposed to the schedule pressure, the political pressure, the cost pressure that made stopping unacceptable. The engineers could argue. They could memorialize their objections in writing. They could refuse to sign certification documents, and some did. But they could not stop the launch. Columbia involved a similar dynamic. Engineers who wanted imagery of the wing impact to assess the potential damage made requests through the established channels. The requests were downgraded. The imagery was not obtained. The people who had the authority to obtain it decided it was not necessary. The question of decision latitude in the Artemis program is not one I can answer from the outside. I do not know how easy it is for an engineer or a flight surgeon or a radiation biologist within NASA to raise a concern that stops a mission. I do not know whether the institutional culture rewards or penalizes people who insist on resolution before certification. I do not know whether the channels for raising such concerns are genuinely open or procedurally open in ways that effectively filter out concerns before they reach decision makers. What I know is that the structural pressures that erode decision latitude are present. The budget pressure is real. The schedule pressure is real. The political pressure to demonstrate American capability in competition with China's lunar program, which successfully landed a robotic mission on the moon's far side in 2018 and has announced crewed lunar ambitions for the early 2030s, is real. And historically, when these pressures exist within the organizations that Vaughn studied, They tend to erode decision latitude in ways that are invisible from inside the institution. There is a mission that has been authorized but not yet flown that represents the clearest test of everything I have described in this piece. Artemis III is intended to land humans on the moon. Specifically, it is planned to land the first woman and the first person of color on the lunar surface, a historic milestone that has been used in congressional testimony, in press releases, and in international partnerships as one of the primary justifications for the program's cost and complexity. The heat shield that will bring the crew home from Artemis III is the same design that cracked in more than 100 locations on Artemis II and was certified for crewed flight on Artemis II. The radiation environment those astronauts will encounter on the lunar surface, which has no magnetic field, no atmosphere, and no protection from either solar energetic particles or galactic cosmic rays, will be substantially greater than anything the Artemis II crew experienced during their flyby. The lunar surface receives approximately 380 millisieverts per year of radiation, roughly 30 times the annual dose on the ISS and more than 300 times the annual dose on Earth's surface. A 30-day stay on the Moon's surface during solar maximum, the period Artemis III will fly in, would deliver a dose that is a meaningful fraction of NASA's career limit in a single mission, and the cardiovascular risk, if the DELP findings are real, is not captured in those career limits at all. The blood samples from Artemis II are in storage. The analysis will take months. The cardiovascular data from the Artemis II crew will take decades. Artemis III is planned for before any of that data is meaningful. I want to close this story not with despair but with something more complicated than despair. Something that I think is closer to what the situation actually calls for, the human impulse to go further, to cross the next ocean, to climb the next mountain, to leave the known environment and venture into the one that might kill you, is not something I am arguing against. It is one of the most genuinely admirable things about the species. Every civilization that has ever existed has had people in it who were willing to go first, to accept risks that could not be fully quantified, to step into the unknown because the unknown was there and they were built to walk toward it rather than away from it. The 12 people who walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972 were such people. Whatever the DELP study eventually tells us about their cardiovascular health, whatever the final verdict of history is on the biological cost of those missions, those 12 human beings did something that I do not think can be evaluated solely through the lens of risk-benefit analysis. They went, they saw, they came back and told us what was there, the Earthrise photograph alone. That image of our blue and white world hanging above the lunar horizon, fragilely and complete and impossibly beautiful against the black, may have done more for human environmental consciousness than any policy enacted before or since. The Artemis II crew did something similar. 4 people went to the neighborhood of the moon and came back and broke a record that had stood for 53 years and demonstrated that the institutional and technical capability to send human beings beyond Earth's magnetosphere has not been lost. That is a genuine achievement. The celebrations on the deck of the USS Portland were earned, but celebrating an achievement and examining its risks are not mutually exclusive activities. The most respectful thing you can do for the people who accept these risks is to understand the risks honestly, not to minimize them for the comfort of the institution, not to declare safety before the data supports the declaration, not to normalize the anomalies that accumulate on the path toward the mission that matters. The Artemis II crew accepted the risks of this mission with full knowledge that some of those risks are not yet quantifiable. That is what it means to be a test crew. That is what it means to be the 25th through 28th human beings to cross beyond Earth's magnetosphere, rather than the 225th. The data that will eventually tell us what we are asking of the people who follow them was not available before they flew. Some of it will only become available because they flew. what we owe them, and what we owe the crews who come after them, is the commitment to take that data seriously, to let it revise our models rather than confirm them, to resist the institutional gravity that bends every anomaly toward acceptability and every successful flight toward evidence of safety, to ask before every mission not whether we have flown this before without dying, but whether we understand what we are flying into well enough to say that the people we are sending deserve our confidence that we have tried, with full honesty, to protect them. The 43% is a number that hangs over the Artemis program like a question mark the size of a generation. We will not know whether it is a genuine signal or a statistical artifact until enough people have traveled to deep space and enough time has passed for the biological consequences, if any, to manifest. By the time we know, the program will be deep into its lunar landing phase. By the time we know, people will have been living at Gateway for months. By the time we know, the commitment to Mars, the 900-day mission, the 900 millisievert exposure, the rolling of a die that comes up dangerous once in 4 may already be underway. We are in the gap between the knowledge we have and the knowledge we need. That gap is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to be honest about what we do not know, rigorous about building the knowledge we lack, and resistant to the institutional habit of mistaking a successful mission for a safe one. Roger Boisjoli knew what was going to happen and said so, and it happened anyway. The board that investigated Columbia said that without fundamental change, NASA would not be able to ensure crew safety and the program continued. The DELP study was published in 2016, and the cardiovascular question it raised remains unresolved, and the next crew is already training. The pattern does not require villains. It only requires the ordinary human tendency to let success feel like safety, let momentum feel like direction, and let the urgency of the destination crowd out the discipline of understanding what the journey actually costs. 12 millisieverts, 18% above prediction, 4 to 5 times elevated cardiovascular mortality in the only people who have ever done what the Artemis II crew just did. These numbers are not catastrophe. They are a question asked by the universe in the only language it speaks, the language of data, of measurement, of the slow accumulation of biological consequence across timescales that institutional calendars are not designed to account for. The question deserves an answer. Not eventually, not after the lunar landing, not after Mars, now, before the next pull of the trigger, before the next crew trains and launches and crosses the line where the magnetosphere ends and the deep space begins, and the cosmic rays that have been traveling for millions of years from the poly remnants of exploded stars arrive, silently and continuously, at bodies that evolution never designed to be there. The universe is patient. It has been sending those particles since before our species existed. It will keep sending them long after the last human being who ever lived has returned to the atoms from which they came. We are the ones in a hurry, and the history of every disaster I have described in this piece is the history of what happens when urgency is allowed to outrun understanding. The path to the lunar surface is open, Jinfrey told us, perhaps, but the path to knowing whether we can walk it safely, not for 10 days, not for one mission, but for the decades of continuous human presence beyond Earth's magnetosphere that the vision of Artemis ultimately requires, that path is not yet open. It is being built, one data point at a time, in blood samples in freezers and dosimetry files, and the cardiovascular records of 4 people who are home now, healthy, going about their lives, carrying in the lining of their blood vessels a molecular record of 10 days beyond the shield that the rest of us have never left. We should want to read that record. We should insist on reading it. We should refuse to let the celebration of what they did crowd out the obligation to understand what it cost them, because the next crew is already training, and the one after that, and somewhere in that sequence, if the pattern holds, If the O-rings keep burning and the foam keeps shedding and the numbers we do not want to look at keep accumulating in the files we do not want to open, somewhere in that sequence, the luck runs out. The question is not whether we want to go to the moon. We do. The question is whether we want to go honestly, with clear eyes about what we know and what we don't, with institutions that can hear the engineers before rather than after, with a willingness to let the data lead even when the data is inconvenient and the schedule is not. That is the future that Artemis II revealed, not the future of the press release, not the future of the standing ovation on the deck of the USS Portland, the future of the question that no one at the press conference asked, and that the data has been trying to answer for 50 years. And that the next generation of human beings beyond the magnetosphere will carry in their bodies whether we choose to look at it or not. If this story made you think differently about something you thought you already understood, if it showed you that the gap between the celebration and the truth is worth paying attention to, then share it with someone who needs to read it. The conversations that matter most are the ones that start with discomfort and end with clarity. Subscribe if you want more of them. The next one is already in progress, and the universe is already accumulating data for it.